Hello and welcome to another video. I am Jonathan MS Pearce, a tippling philosopher. Today I'm going to speak about this idea of having sufficient evidence. Quite often you hear people say, particularly Christians say, there is sufficient evidence out there to believe. So this idea that we all have sufficient evidence to believe, what does that really mean? And I suppose what I'm going to be talking about has a linguistic element to it, as well as having theological impact. So I've been having this ongoing discussion, argument on my blog over whether or not God is unfair in unequally distributing evidence over time and place in the world, thus giving people unequal opportunity of access to believe in God, of access to God, of access to God's love. So we could see this as, say, someone living in the Amazonian rainforest 3,000 years ago, and we could see that in terms of doubting Thomas, who got to poke Jesus literally, his resurrected body. And someone in the middle, say, who lives now, who's read the Bible but has had no other evidence outside the Bible. We've got a range of different evidences that humans are given to believe in, to access God and God's love. And a Catholic apologist, Dave Armstrong, and then another more philosophical commenter on my blog, a guy called Verbose Stoic, have both made the claim that there is sufficient evidence for everyone to believe. So Armstrong stated, and this is a quote, "I think God does provide sufficient evidence of all sorts for every human being, but human beings have various mechanisms by which they rationalise such things away or reject them. If it's not efficient enough to bring about belief, I'm not a Calvinist and believe in human free choices and free will, then one can either criticise God or point out that perhaps the person involved has an irrational demand. The fault can conceivably be on either side. God's not to blame for everything, as many of his critics seem to think." And this chap, Verbose Stoic, added, "If God provided evidence that should be sufficient for everyone, then the person would still be responsible for rejecting it, and that some do find it sufficient is reason to think that, at least in theory, everyone should at least be able to come to that belief based on that evidence, and that the difference between you and them is due to personal things about you that you can potentially impact and change." So let's unpick this problem of uneven evidence, but more particularly about whether there is sufficient evidence. So here's a proposition. Proposition: I have a litre of petrol and it is sufficient fuel to get me from Portsmouth to Southampton. So my claim that this litre of petrol is sufficient fuel to get me from Portsmouth to Southampton, and in a sense to get anyone from Portsmouth to Southampton. Scenario 1. I put the litre of petrol into my Ford Focus, the only car I own, and drive it from Portsmouth to Southampton. The proposition is true. Scenario 2. I put the litre of petrol into my Ford Focus, the only car I own, but the car has a fuel pump leak. I get halfway from Portsmouth to Southampton. The proposition is false. Scenario 3. I put the litre of petrol in my Volkswagen Passat diesel, the only car I own, and attempt to drive. The car breaks down. The proposition is false. Scenario 4. I put the litre of petrol in my Humvee, the only car I own. The vehicle gets halfway there and runs out of fuel because it has a very inefficient engine. The proposition is false. Scenario 5. I have no car. I'm going to walk and use the petrol as fuel. I drink the petrol and die. The proposition is false. Or I don't drink it and try to walk, but I can't do it because I've got MS. And the proposition is still false. The proposition that I have sufficient fuel to get from Portsmouth to Southampton is true if and only if, considering all these scenarios, I can drive, I have a working Ford Focus, put fuel in that car and drive that vehicle. In all other scenarios, I do not have sufficient fuel to get from Portsmouth to Southampton. Therefore, the blanket use of sufficient as a term is erroneous, which is to say the term sufficient is context dependent. It would be special pleading to use scenario 1, where I've got a Ford Focus. As the only car, it takes petrol, I put petrol in it, and it gets me from A to B, as a benchmark for all realities. And thus claiming that scenario 1, that 1 litre of petrol, therefore, in claiming that 1 litre of petrol is sufficient fuel to get me from Portsmouth to Southampton. It can do it in particular contexts, but it won't always do it. There seems to be this nebulous, arbitrary, special pleaded theoretical sufficiency. So I think here it's assuming that here's one context where there is enough fuel. Let's say here's one context where there is enough evidence for someone to believe. Therefore, there is enough evidence for everyone to believe. And it's that blanket understanding of sufficient that I think is a problem. So verbose Stoic came back with another comment later, saying, let me use this example. This is his quote. We can agree, I think, that there is sufficient evidence available in the world to show that the world is round, not flat. We can say this despite the fact that some people do not agree that there is sufficient evidence to show that. Given this is an epistemic fact, we can say that anyone who does not accept that the world is round and believes that the world is flat must either have not sought out the evidence that they can attain, or that there is something about them that is causing them to reject the evidence and what it shows, despite the fact that it is clearly sufficient to show that the world is round. Thus, given the evidence we have, we can say that the evidence is sufficient so that any reasonable person will accept that the world is round. And one of my commenters on my blog, Cynthia, replied, but what if that person was raised in a community of flat earthers? If someone never learned some of the basic math and science needed to understand the proofs, if they weren't exposed to anyone who had flown, if they were sheltered to the degree that people closer to them said flat earth, and they didn't have any personal connections to those who said otherwise, would it be a choice? Also, non-Christians could perhaps better be described as people who simply don't have a firm view on the shape of the world and maybe don't think about it much. If someone lived in a society where they didn't fly or sail beyond the horizon or know about the round earth teaching, there may not be a reason to think about it. And another commenter, Eric, chipped in, 1. We don't expect this level of understanding from the very young or those who are not exposed to the evidence, including past people such as those living in the Stone Age, etc. 2. We do not send literally everyone who doesn't believe in a round earth, including the very young and those who have not been exposed to this evidence, people living in the Stone Age, etc., to eternal torture for not having this understanding. So there are major differences between this kind of flat earth scenario and believing in God. And I just think this understanding of sufficient is incorrect. Sufficient does not entail a range. Sufficient means enough for a particular purpose. If I need to put oil in my car for the engine to run, then I put in, say, 1 litre. All things remaining equal, this is sufficient. Of course, if my car has a hole in a pump somewhere, then this is not sufficient. To get to the next town, I need to put in 2 litres to overcome the leak. 2 litres is the sufficient, the required amount. In that scenario, 1 litre is not sufficient. It should be sufficient if we made inaccurate assumptions about my car by comparing it to another car of the same make and model, but without the leak. Ceteris paribus, all things remaining equal. All people aren't equal, so therefore one person's sufficient is not a benchmark able to be applied to all humanity. All things are not equal, and they almost never are. So a sufficient amount of oil will change from car to car, as well as the type of oil. Sufficient evidence and type of evidence will change from person to person, no matter what the belief you are talking about. What Armstrong originally in his quote is erroneously saying is that 10 units of evidence that the moon landings never happened is sufficient for Harry to believe in a conspiracy theory. Therefore, 10 units of evidence is sufficient for Julie. But Julie is a scientist and a skeptic whose uncle worked on the NASA team, so 10 units simply isn't sufficient for her to believe in that conspiracy theory. This is kind of skeptical thinking 101. So there is, I think, a real contradiction, and this was exemplified by Dave Armstrong again in his quote. I think God does provide sufficient evidence of all sorts for every human being, but human beings have various mechanisms by which they rationalise such things away or reject them. And that should be translated as, I think God does provide sufficient evidence for every human being, but all human beings are different, meaning that the evidence isn't actually sufficient. Or A does not equal A. So, it's a problem, and I think even thinkers like Dave Armstrong accept this because he then goes on to say that the entity who knowingly created and designed everything in existence, in the full knowledge it would do what it would do because it was designed in that way, and this is the problem with the all-knowing God, the full divine knowledge, designing and creating humanity, even though many people wouldn't believe and would sin and would do this and would do that, and he creates anyway. So Dave Armstrong then said the fault can conceivably be on either side. God's not to blame for everything. I completely contest that. God is to blame for everything. God designed and created literally everything, okay? Knowingly. And so I don't understand how you get to not blame God, the ultimate creator, designer and creator. How you can not blame God ultimately for everything that comes to pass, especially if he knew in advance that it would come to pass and designed and created it that way anyway. So I think we have a real problem with this idea that humanity has sufficient evidence to believe. I say there is a range from, say, 0% to 99.9% evidence of Christian God. So the 0% would be an Amazonian tribesperson living 2,500 years ago, and 99.9% might be Thomas poking the resurrected Jesus' body. Somewhere in that range is a theoretical sweet spot where every reasonable person should believe in the Christian God. But of course, this is a very Christocentric way of looking at things. We can also apply this to every single other religion in the world and atheism. There's sufficient evidence for atheism, there's sufficient evidence for Islam, there's sufficient evidence for Hinduism, which rather invalidates this whole argument that these apologists put forward. I literally think there is theoretically ample enough evidence for people to disbelieve in any God. However, people have different brains and very different contexts, environmental and biological factors. So everyone should believe in a spherical Earth if they were like me, right? And if they were so much like me that they were effectively synonymous with me, then they would believe in a spherical Earth. But not everyone is like me, sadly enough. Obvs. People are very different and their contexts are wildly different. So someone who was brought up in a staunchly Islamic household, let's call them A, or a very atheistic household, B, will require different levels of evidence to believe in the Christian God than someone who was brought up in an evangelical household, or Bible Belt America, and we'll call them C. So this much should be pretty obvious. The evidence sufficient for C, Bible Belt American, is vastly different than that for A or B. And don't forget that someone like our commenters earlier have a broadly similar neurological setup to me. I mean, we both believe the world is spherical, right? However, we have hugely different contexts, and although we have the same amount of evidence for the Christian God, we both believe antithetically about the proposition that such an entity exists. We evaluate that evidence incredibly differently. We both have different desires about whether a God exists, and we both have different functional requirements resulting from the different contexts of our lives concerning such an entity. And this is basic psychology of religion stuff here. You know, it might not be so different between myself and, say, verbose Stoic, as it will be between, say, someone in war-torn Islamic Middle East and myself. But there will still be a difference. God is functional, and when we replace a God with other things that do the same functional job, we have no need for a God in a psychological sense. In this paradigm, verbose Stoic and myself are no doubt at least a little different, and that will explain how we evaluate the evidence in different ways. Out of our desires and functional requirements emerges confirmation bias. So A, B and C, those people I talked about before, an Islamic person, an atheist and a Bible Belt Christian American, will evaluate exactly the same evidence for, say, the Christian God with very different metrics and outcomes. That's a confirmation bias, and that's dependent upon our context. So I can't stress this enough. The same amount of evidence is not sufficient for those three different people. In this case, it's sufficient for C, but not for A and B. Theoretical sufficiency is simply not a robust enough benchmark to apply across humanity. When both of my interlocutors here that I've mentioned earlier talk about sufficient, what they really mean is theoretically sufficient for someone who's just like me. And the world doesn't really work like that. There you go. There isn't sufficient evidence for everyone to believe in the Christian God.